coming from a cultural Calvinist background, I don't believe in saying grace, and so I don't believe in simply reciting the words of the ANU authorised acknowledgement of country. But I'd like you to know that where we are today is land on which people, Aboriginal people of Australia, have been living for centuries and for millennia. And that what we do today, talking about the art history of Southeast Asia, is not directly related to their existence, but we do owe our presence here to the fact that that land, which was once entirely theirs, is now shared with other Australians. So our speaker today is Professor Adrian Vickers. Many of you will know Adrian very well, but for the handful who don't, I'd say a few words of introduction. Adrian is the doyen of cultural historians of Indonesia in Australia, certainly, and possibly in the world. His field, especially, is the history of Indonesian culture, but his work has ranged much more widely than that. He's best known for 3 volumes. The first of them, Bali, A Paradise Created, which was the first and dramatic deconstruction of the myth that Bali was a paradise for all who spent time there. The second was his History of Modern Indonesia, which is widely set in universities as a text on modern Indonesia, and is distinguished, amongst other things, by the fact that although it's a textbook, it's based on original research, and it's also a great deal more readable than many of its competitors. He's also increasingly known for a recent prize-winning book called The Pearl Frontier, which he wrote with Julia Martinez, which explores the role of Indonesian labourers in the pearl industry the pearling industry in Northern Australia over 2 or 3 centuries.
Well, at least a century.
At least a century, okay. Adrian is also one of very few historians of Indonesia who has published in History and Theory, which is a goal that many of us aspire to, but few have achieved. And he has a broad interest in the way in which history is constructed. So today's lecture is going to tie together both his specific interest in Indonesia's cultural history, specifically the history of art in Indonesia, and its relationship to history more generally. Adrian, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Robert. And thank you to those at home viewing, and to our small audience here, some of whom you can see on one of the screens, although most of them are out of shot and are moving rapidly out of shot if they were in shot. Yeah, so I'm not quite sure where to start on this, but I suppose one of the things I wanted to do in this talk was to, as Robert said, try to tie together a number of different issues or approaches, and to also bring together some thoughts about the ways that we write history and art history. So this comes out of a series of projects, one ARC linkage on Balinese art, and another ARC project with John Clark, Siobhan Campbell, and others on modern and contemporary Indonesian art, but also 2 projects funded by the Getty Foundation, Ambitious Alignments and Site and Space in Southeast Asia, where we've been discussing a whole range of issues to do with visual culture and art history. And in one of the, I think it was an Ambitious Alignments workshop, somebody said to me, well, why don't you talk about art history using your historiography background? And I took that as a useful challenge. Because in some ways, writing history and writing art history are very similar, and a lot of art history that's done now particularly is more like cultural history in general. That is the idea of tracing objects and putting visual representations within a wider range of activities or a wider range of cultural frameworks. But there's also particular problems with how you do this in Southeast Asia. And that takes me back to another starting point. I think it was 2011, there was a seminar on Southeast Asian art history organised by what is now the National Gallery of Singapore. And this was actually a kind of planning seminar, and a number of us were invited to take part in that and to contribute ideas for how they were going to be framing art history within the structure of that gallery. And I'm not sure whether all of you have been to see what they've done, but there is this whole idea of Southeast Asian art history within the way that the gallery is composed. And it has a Southeast Asia wing and a Singapore wing. And Nora Taylor, who probably it's too early in the morning for her to be part of this, but I think she might have asked to watch a recording, said it that, made a comment about, well, we don't have art history of Southeast Asia. We just have art history in Southeast Asia. So trying to make the distinction between the idea that there is various forms of visual representation going on in Southeast Asia, but it doesn't necessarily add up to a Southeast Asian art history, if I interpreted her correctly. And I think she was also taking her idea from Claire Holt's Art in Indonesia, which is really a foundational book for understanding not just Indonesian art history, but Southeast Asian art history. And so I've been thinking about this for for the last 10 years anyway, and still trying to work out whether we can actually talk about a joined up history of art in Southeast Asia, whether such a thing is possible. And in particular, as soon as you start to do anything around this, you meet the problem that you have individual national art histories, but do they actually connect? So that's one of the problems that I'll be talking about. And then you have an additional problem that even the individual art histories actually don't join up that well. There's more discontinuities, more gaps than there are ways of talking about just lines of progression, or how you might move from one school of art to another, what kinds of formal changes might take place, where we're probably familiar with the standard European teleology by which you move from classical art to realism to impressionism to post-impressionism to cubism, and eventually end up with abstract expressionism. That kind of teleology doesn't really exist in Southeast Asia, and even attempts to create it are faced with huge kinds of gaps. There's kind of historical gaps, and Cambodian art history is an example where, of course, after 1975 or even after 1970, there's just literally a gap where so many of the population were killed in the Khmer Rouge period, and a lot of those people were artists. So there's a huge space there. But I'll mention briefly Indonesia in 1965, of course, as another example of that. But even outside of those major catastrophes, you have all of these other problems of sources and problems of gaps and relationships. So I'll start off with a gap, which is a gap in Indonesian art history. And I'll begin by talking about Indonesian art history, although my opening slide, which is an illustration of a work by somebody who's in the audience on Zoom. So hi, Poptawan. And I'll get to Thailand and Cambodia as other examples as we go along, but with some brief reference to Malaysia and some thoughts about other bits that join up as well. But yeah, the Indonesian point of question of what is history and art history is this exhibition. It was held in 1976, and I've been doing research in the ARC project on reconstructing the exhibition and tracing where all the artworks went. But this was a 1976 exhibition called A Century of Indonesian Art. And it specifically refers to the idea of a century of modern Indonesian art, although it doesn't use the word modern. So it goes from 1876 to 1976, although in the usual Indonesian style, there's nothing actually that happened in Indonesian art history in 1876, but somehow because the exhibition was in 1976, that was a convenient starting point. And this was really the first Indonesian attempt to map out the whole history of modern art through an exhibition. It was held in what is now the Museum Seni Rupa dan Keramik in Jakarta, and part of their permanent collection was part of this exhibition. And in fact, the collection was put together as part of that exhibition with contributions from the national collection, and Indonesia did not have a national art gallery until 1999, but it had a national collection, and it's also had, most famously, the presidential collection, or the Sukarno collection, which is now housed in presidential palaces. But works from that and the national collection were also included in this exhibition. But the framing point for this exhibition, and here's there was a whole issue of tempo devoted to it, was the two founding fathers, Raden Saleh, the 19th century painter who painted in Europe and spent much of his life in Europe, but was also quite active in the then Netherlands East Indies, and whose house was part of the site of what is now the Taman Ismail Marzuki, and Sugiono, the sort of founder of nationalist art, who was one of the leaders of a group who first proclaimed that art should play a role in the service of nationalism. So here you've got two founding fathers, but as the dates tell you, there's a century between them. So it's like, here we have gap number 1, 100 years of art, what happened? Because there's nothing that directly connects Sugiono to Raden Saleh. And there's not those, X studied with Y, studied with Z kinds of linkages where you can see a direct set of teachings or a direct formal descent from Raden Saleh to Sugiono. So this is the first problem to face. But secondly, there's also the problem of talking about Sugiono, because he's talked about as a realist painter and his art is discussed in terms of realism. But we also see in Sugiono's work, particularly early works like this, Cap Gome, one of the first documented works we have from Sugiono, you can see that what is going on is actually a form of modernism, a form of moving away from naturalistic representations to experimentation with colour, with form, with unusual kinds of composition. And although his work covered a huge range of different modes of painting, that still this does speak to something that Sugiono was doing. So in art history terms, he was trying to be a modernist. We know from other documentation that he and his contemporaries were exposed to the most modern of European art at the time. That a paint factory owner called Reno from the Netherlands had an amazing collection of his own artworks, but also artworks on loan from other people like Vincent van Gogh's brother. And Reno held a series of exhibitions in the Indies of people like Escher, who would probably be not Escher, sorry, no, mental block. Okay, Van Gogh and a number of other leading European modernists who would have been seen by Indonesian artists like Sugiono, and we know that Sugiono went to the Kunstskring building where a number of the exhibitions were held. Yeah, there was something like 14 Van Gogh paintings that were in the Indies, and a number of them stayed in the Netherlands East Indies during World War II, hidden in somebody's attic. So there's a kind of whole other story there. Okay, so modernism was important, but also the idea that this modernism should be directed towards a particular cause, which was commentary on, first of all, on colonial conditions, and then in later works by Sugiono, commentary on the nature of nationalism and the national struggle. And Sugiono's co-founder of Persagi, the nationalist art group, Hendra, for example, was one of many who depicted aspects of the Indonesian Revolution, again using modern style, but in a way that was meant to contribute to the idea of forming the nation. And people talked about the role of their art as also having a particular nationalist role, that is drawing on different cultural currents within Indonesia to create a kind of national spirit through art. So an important role. However, that's not the whole story, because we do get other currents within Indonesian art and from the period of the 40s and 50s. So Kartono Yudokusumo, who was a student of Sugiono's or had close family links to Sugiono, for example, left us, he died very young in a motorbike accident, left us amazing works like this, which again are very, very modernist, not necessarily speaking to the nationalist agenda, but speaking to other agendas in art history. And later artists from the kind of generation just slightly younger than Sugiono included Johnny Sutrisno, who was particularly an artist to whom Claire Holt worked with in the 1950s when she was doing field work on modern Indonesian art. But also, intriguingly, Johnny Trisno was a member of the left-wing communist-affiliated Institute of People's Culture, Likra, which is usually seen as a body that was associated with, not with formal innovation and modernism in art, but associated with the idea of realism, and particularly social realism, or what some of its members wanted to push towards socialist realism. So art in the service of the people to deal with people's issues. So trying to even put that little story together tells us that there's a role for modern art and there's a role for the presentation of the modern in art, but there's not a very straightforward single path, that you get these varieties of forms of modernism that come up. You get people who are ostensibly realists experimenting with colour, with form in quite dramatic ways. But there's a question of where they're coming from and what exactly they're trying to do. So one of one of the problems that bedeviled Southeast Asian art for a long time was that it was regarded as derivative, as kind of second-rate European artists or just copies of European art. And somebody who organised an exhibition in the US in the 70s on modern Indonesian art told me of his experiences of, people were really dismissive, that other art, other people interested in other forms of art just saw this art as kind of secondary modernism, or modernism that was an echo of European forms rather than having its own kind of trajectory. However, there are two things that I think are important to consider in this. And first of all, it's the fact that so much of the art draws from different kinds of intentions, and particularly from anti-colonial intentions. So there's an idea of using European forms, but in a way that participates in a global culture, and with artists like Sugiono in an anti-colonial form. But then also there's well springs of this art that have nothing to do necessarily with seeing great works of European art, but are more about trying to make sense of new art forms that draw on traditions within their own culture. So the Indonesian artists who were working in the 1940s and 1950s up to the 60s were deliberately going and looking at their own art forms and trying to create something that drew on that. And we can see this in Johnny Trisno's both depictions of traditional dance forms, but also the idea that he's using, particularly in the left-hand image, he's using images from Indigenous folk art, as he probably would have thought of it. In this case, the barong and related, the reog performances of Central and East Java, to try to work out what the relationship between those forms and modern forms of art might be. And amongst other artists, there's also attempts to draw on regional traditional styles of art, but then also others such as Agus Jaya were interested in the forms of Borobudur and other Prambanan, other kinds of ancient Indic art forms. So there's a move towards what we regard as the traditional within these modern arts. And I think this is a useful starting point for trying to delve into that art history, but also to look at how that kind of art history connects with other kinds of art history in Southeast Asia. So, and this is a word I'll be coming back to, this is not so much about necessarily drawing on a direct continuity of tradition as referring to tradition. Okay, whoa, what's happened here? Sorry, hit the wrong button. Okay, but it does, and I just wanted to briefly mention that it does carry over into more recent contemporary art as well. And so the stream of realism is there, but a realism that has references within Indonesian culture and is not necessarily referring outside that culture. So let's go back at a point to explain that by trying to fill in some of the gaps between Raden Saleh and Sugiono, because filling in such gaps also helps to explain what this reference to tradition might be. Okay, so Raden Saleh was an amazing painter. As I mentioned, he worked a lot in Europe and did portraits in Europe, but one of the one of the projects that he did in the Indies was a series of portraits, many of them posthumous, such as this one, of governors general of the Indies. And they were actually part of the state collection that ended up in, there were some of the ones that were photographed by Cartier-Bresson in that great series of photos of moving all the Dutch colonial gear out of the presidential palace in 1949 in preparation for Sukarno to take over. And so that collection actually ended up back in the Netherlands. This is one of the works. So Raden Saleh is usually explained as somebody who trained in Europe, and indeed he trained with people like Delacroix, but he's seen as separate from an Indonesian tradition. But usually in explanations of Raden Saleh, there's very little mention of what happens next. So part of that story is actually that Raden Saleh did have a number of pupils. We have at least 3, possibly 4 names of artists who studied under Raden Saleh and intriguingly became art teachers and were trained in education colleges as teachers for students, and presumably most of these would have been students from the elite, but possibly they may have had or at least their students may have had a broader audience. Now, most of these come, like Raden Saleh, as the title Raden indicates, from somewhere in the aristocracy, or at least the lower ranks of people of higher status who would have had access to different kinds of education. So there's lots of Radins and Radin Mas, and even some of the more modern nationalist artists turn out to have a similar kind of genealogy. So this guy, Raden Kusumadibrata, was actually from West Java. He was from a family of a Bupati, or a regent. But intriguingly, I saw this artwork in it was on loan to the National Gallery of Singapore for ages. Not sure whether it's still there, but it's from the Tropen Museum collection. And this is a portrait of another regent, Raden Arya Kusumadiningrat, who was regent of Galuh. And it turns out that this guy, Kusumadiningrat, was actually a really, really powerful figure and somebody who played the nationalist game, but also played the game of being a Dutch civil servant very well. And when you read his accounts, he did a lot accounts of him. He did a lot in terms of developing the area of Galuh as a kind of a traditional style kingdom, built a palace, built a nice garden, sponsored a whole lot of other activities, including, it seems, a genealogy of the royal house of Galuh, which is a kind of patched on royal house connected with other royal houses from Cirebon. And at the same time was seen as a kind of loyal citizen by the Dutch. That is, he was seen as enacting their laws. And in this portrait, you actually have there's a book right next to him, which is the colonial kind of, the civil service manual, if you like. But at the same time, he's got a royal umbrella of traditional Southeast Asian rulers and a kris at the back, and he's depicted in traditional costume. I won't go further into his story, but he's one of those people on the cusp of dealing with tradition, but also trying to create a new kind of modern world to bring Indonesians in. And so he's actually the subject of a whole series of photographs by Dutch and other photographers. And as well, this is one of a number of portraits, but it's the most significant portrait of him. So we have at least one student of Raden Saleh who was there painting portraits of Indigenous leaders and presenting them as, if you like, not quite on the same level, but within the same framework as portraits of governors general. And Raden Saleh did a couple of regents' portraits himself, but his followers were also engaged in this. Now, unfortunately, we've lost most of the works of Raden Saleh's followers. There's an 1883 exhibition in Amsterdam that records, it had a whole bunch of Raden Saleh's paintings, but it had sketches and other coloured artworks by this guy, Mangku Miharjo, and Raden Soma, another one of Raden Saleh's followers, but we have we can't connect those to any known works. And even this is the only image I could find by another one of Raden Saleh's followers, Mangku Miharjo, a pencil drawing of a street in Java published in a 1942 article, which it may be somewhere still in a Dutch collection, we don't know. However, this tells us in the 19th century that, so probably this would have been done at the same time as his other works in the 1883 exhibition, that in the second half of the 19th century there were a number of artists active, and they eventually connect up with this guy, Mas Gadi, who was another member of the aristocracy, who was the teacher of Sugiono. So we do get some kinds of connections there. And it does seem like there's a bunch of aristocratic painters who are doing both oilworks and watercolours and sketches of scenes of Java, and some of them may have also been active on other islands. And I'll move over that. But at the same time, there's also a bunch of artists who are the court artists of the kingdoms of Central Java. So Yogyakarta and Surakarta, the two royal capitals of Central Java, had a number of court painters. We don't know a lot. We've only been able to trace a few of their works. So this, for example, is very beautiful Bimaruchi text, which was originally collected by Merle Recliffs and donated to the National Gallery of Victoria, is an example of the kinds of artworks that people were doing in the 1880s, including depictions of landscapes as well as wayang scenes. So you're getting this kind of traditional modern crossover, indicating that there were so-called traditional artists who were working with a variety of different modes, colours, experimenting with different forms. We have a couple of other names, Ngabe Wigno Suwarno and Ngabe Wigno Wichoro from Solo, who also had artworks in the 1883 Dutch exhibition. And I've been able to find at least 6 or 8 court artists from Jogja and Solo from the mid to the late 19th century. Mid to late 19th century to the early 20th century. And this is one of the last of those, Raden Wongso Di Mejo, who may have been working in the 1880s, although there's a later work of his which is a portrait of Hamengkubuwono VII, indicating that he was still active in the first part of the 20th century. And again, this is not a traditional work of art. It's a portrait, a face-on portrait, so it's not a wayang style or anything. In this case, of two heroes of the Java War, and on the right, Pangeran Diponegoro, also the subject of a painting by Raden Saleh, a very famous painting which has been seen as a kind of proto-nationalist image. And this tells us that, in fact, there's a huge amount of art going on, which we see a kind of tip of the iceberg coming out in the modern artists. So in a sense, Sugiono and even Raden Saleh are not the artists. They're not the founding artists. They are two of a number, probably two of the best, of a number of other artists who were practicing at that time, and art is going on at the same time. But the fact that Raden Wongso Dimetjo was a court artist for the Sultan of Yogyakarta also tells us that there was different kinds of patronage going on, and that the people consuming this kind of art were Indonesians within that court setting, but that they were interested in more than just traditional art. So, or interested in modern styles of art. Now, I've in other publications, my book on Balinese art history, I've talked a lot about the fact that when you start to dig into Indonesian art, you find that there are alternative streams of modernism, that what we call the modern, that is, ways of experimenting with form, experimenting with different modes of representation, is not something that is created by Europeans coming into the Indies, but it's something that's an ongoing process from at least the 19th century. So even within traditional art styles like the classic Kamasan art of Klungkung, that you have people innovating, coming up with new ways, new forms of representation. And in, as I've documented in the case of Bali in the 20s and 30s, this moves into a full-blown form of modernism, which Europeans are impressed by and adopt. So people like Walter Spies, Rudolf Bonnet, Miguel Covarrubias see this kind of work and start to patronise it and buy artworks, but they're not the originators of this kind of modernist art. And in the case of Bali, it has a quite different trajectory to the main trajectory of accounts of modern Indonesian art. Amazing kinds of work going on, which moves towards forms of abstraction and very, very different kinds of forms of representation, particularly in the work of this guy, Dewa Kompiang Kando Ruka, who we have worked out possibly, probably, most likely influenced MC Escher. So, because somebody had put up a thing about, oh, he must have been influenced by Escher. And then when we did, for some friends and I did the reconstruction, it's the other way around. But that's a kind of separate story. And going into forms of contemporary art like Murni, the incredibly innovative and kind of challenging feminist artist who died far too young in 2006, that her work draws on a wellspring of Balinese innovation in modernism, but at the same time was part of the kind of contemporary art world, as is this guy, Teja Astawa, a contemporary practicing artist who deliberately plays with and refers to these forms of traditional art. Now, that brings us to Poptawan Swanakut, who I think is a useful, like her work is a useful way to then say, is that story I've told in Indonesia one that works for other places? Do you have those kinds of works? So Poptawan, for those of you who don't know her, is a Thai Australian artist. She trained with her father, who is a temple mural painter in Thailand, and she brings many of the aspects of mural art into other kinds of contemporary artworks. And here this set of panels from the Art Gallery of New South Wales demonstrates that move from Thai mural art into contemporary forms, and she has a number of different other directions in her work that I can't, there's too much to cover all aspects of it. But what intrigues me about her art is the ways that she is consciously drawing on mural art forms, but doing other things with them. So turning that into another form of contemporary art, which has unique Thai shapes. And that in turn takes us not just to Thai mural art, but other areas like Thai manuscript art, where again, when we look at what is traditional art, and this British Museum Thai manuscript is a nice example, we can see that already in the 19th century, you had Thai artists who were starting within that framework of tradition to innovate, be interested in landscapes, be interested in that whole idea of playing with different points of view, perspective, incorporating what we might regard as naturalistic depictions within the so-called stereotypical imagery of the kind of Thai version of a wayang puppet forms. And again, moving from traditional flat imagery into three-dimensional space. So the tradition that Poptawan is calling on is also an innovative tradition. It's also a modernising tradition, moving away from just that idea of tradition as a flat kind of a static form that somehow was improved or changed or made modern when European art arrived in Thailand. And in the Thai version, it's that story is via an Italian art teacher. But already before that happened, we have examples of Thai artists who were innovating within that tradition. And I don't have time to show you, but I could do similar illustrations for Burma. And again, the British Museum, if you check out some of their digitised illustrated manuscripts online, there's fantastic resources there from Java, Burma, Thailand, that show in the 19th century the incredible range of art that's been produced in different parts of Southeast Asia. Whoops, what's happened? Okay. Now, what also interests me is that Poptawan is not an isolated example, and that artists like Teja Stawa or Murni are not isolated examples, that almost everywhere you go in Southeast Asia, you can find these examples of artists drawing on traditional forms. So here from Cambodia, Chim Sati, who has produced a number of different works which make reference to mural art and Thai Buddhist art. It's hard to see, but in the middle of this scene, there's a kind of Buddha figure or an Apsara figure that looks like it could be something taken from a temple mural wall, but merged with other kinds of patterning and experimentation, both with the kinds of reliefs and patterned reliefs that you find in temples like Angkor Wat, and what we might regard as folk imagery in the fish bones, but combined into more daring contemporary art forms. And here's a clearer example of that reference to here the Angkor Wat Apsara figures, the dancing goddesses or nymphs, and the imagery that comes from temple reliefs, but is also found in traditional textiles and so on. So there's a range of references that mean these people are drawing, that Chim Soti is drawing on traditional training, but also referring more directly to those traditional forms. Likewise, here's a Malaysian example, Reza Piyadasa, who is in his work depicting aspects of Malaysian society, but drawing on different kinds of references. And here he's incorporated a North Coast Javanese batik into this imagery of a Haji's family in Malaysia, and making commentaries about the nature of families, but also about what a Haji might draw on in terms of related imagery. Okay, so how do we then get to a joined up story of Southeast Asia? So what I've shown is a bunch of parallels. So we see in Poptawan's work parallels with what people in Burma or Cambodia are doing. But does this add up to an art of Southeast Asia, or is it a bunch of national arts in Southeast Asia? And I kind of had this sort of flash of insight when I was asked to give a talk in Phnom Penh, and Roger Nelson, who supplied this image and a number of the other images that I've used, who Roger has done amazing research on Nek Tim, another sort of lost Cambodian artist, and helped to reconstruct both Nek Tim's work, but also the context of that. It struck me in looking at a whole range of Nek Tim's work that there were amazing parallels with what was happening at the same time as he was working in the 1960s and 1970s with Indonesian art forms. So this landscape could easily have been done by Mas Pinggadi or one of the other Indonesian landscape painters that from an earlier era. Likewise, this imagery of peasants working in the field had a lot of resonances with the left-wing art, the social realist artists of art of Likra. And there's this question of, so is this just a coincidence? When we get into that imagery of workers, peasants, and other stories, we find, for example, art of the Philippines, which does similar kinds of things, a depiction of peasants. Art of Singapore, although we're not allowed to talk about it too much, left-wing art of Singapore, and of course the Indonesian art of Likra that was going around. So it's like, okay, this is more than just parallel. It seems like there are similar kinds of currents going around in the 1960s. And we find, for example, art that circulates in Indonesia, and this is an amazing Likra woodcut from the 1960s that probably also has reference to Cathay Kolowitz's art, and she was another artist who was exhibited in Indonesia in the colonial period in the Regno exhibition. So people actually knew of her art independently of anything that might have been circulating in the 50s and 60s. But what was also interesting when Roger showed me a whole range of Cambodian examples was this particular work, a well-known work from the Likra artists, and its similarities to this work. from the Cambodian artist Sam Nguyen. Sorry, I put his name twice in the title there. Now, you might say, okay, they were all leftists so they must have spoken to each other or dealt with each other. And I've interviewed Likra people, and I've said, well, did you have any artists come over from Singapore or Cambodia? They kind of went, no, not really. No, we didn't know any Singaporeans. But what is more interesting is the fact that a whole lot of these artists were all taken on exhibitions to Eastern Europe. So the Likra artists and the Cambodian artists, for example, went to East Germany and took part in big socialist art exhibitions in East Germany. And likewise, Siobhan Campbell's done some great work on tracing where Indonesian artists exhibited. And we now have an extensive catalogue of exhibitions in Moscow, in Berlin and Dresden in this case, of Indonesian artworks, but they were exhibiting alongside Cambodian artists. Or if the actual artists themselves weren't there, then at least some of the artists would have seen each other's work, if not in person, through catalogues and other kinds of records. So in fact, there is a conversation, and there has been this conversation going on. Sometimes the central reference points for that conversation is actually in Europe, or what's happening within the socialist world. And so we've missed a lot of those reference points because a lot of the records that we've looked at have been US or other kinds of things. And we've missed this whole other conversation going on in the second world of the Cold War, that the second and the third worlds were actually speaking to each other and making direct connections to each other. But more than this, there's actually that sense that a sense of referentiality going on. So at the same time as Indonesians and Cambodians are being exhibited together in East Germany, they're also going along with their leaders to things like the Bandung Conference or presidential and other kinds of visits. And we know that there's, from Jenny Lindsay's and other people's work, that there was a huge number of cultural embassies that went out from Indonesia, but from other places. And so these are kind of intriguing because we don't really know the full story. But in the record of Nek Dim's work, particularly these a series of artworks that he did for Sihanouk, he did these two works which refer to Bogor and West Java. It may be that Nek Dim went along with Sihanouk on one of Sihanouk's visits to West Java, or it may be that this is his imagination of those landscapes. We don't quite know, but there's something going on there which is about referentiality. So I'm left with this thought, which I think fits in really well with what Chow Beng-Huat and others have talked about when they talk about inter-Asia connections, how bits of Asia connect together in a way that we can talk of Asia. And in this case, I'll confine it to Southeast Asia. But what Chow Beng-Huat and others have talked about is the idea not necessarily that you get a whole series of economic or other kinds of ties that link Asia together, but that conceptually, by making reference to other parts of Asia, there's a concept of Asia that grows up in this interreferencing. And it seems to me that that's what's happening in this artwork here, that Southeast Asians are imagining themselves as part of Southeast Asia through making reference to other parts. Nek Dim had experience of the Philippines and probably other parts of mainland Southeast Asia. He may have indeed gone to Indonesia, although we don't have the documentation. But imaginatively, he was connecting to his fellow Indonesian artists in a way that says that, okay, we don't have the direct lines of connections. We don't have, we don't have an Indonesian learning from a Thai artist, or a Thai learning from a Burmese artist. But we do have this kind of mutual imagining. And I think that that is the basis more of a Southeast Asian art history, which is more like a kind of cultural history. So I started off talking about historical gaps and art historical gaps, but I've ended up talking about more a kind of cultural studies approach to Southeast Asian art that is more about studying the art, so not leaving the art for its context, but looking at the ways that the art makes reference to other things. So the art making reference to earlier art forms in each country, or making reference to their own tradition in creating modernity, but making reference to other people's art. And I believe that we see this in the Nanyang School of Singapore artists, who went out in the 1950s to Bali, most famously to depict Bali. But also other Indonesian artists did the same thing of imagining Bali as part of Indonesia, much as Latif Mohidin from Malaysia imagined other parts of Southeast Asia through his works in the 60s. Here we see one of his Thai paintings, and more recently Balinese-born Yogyakarta-based artist Putu Sutuwijaya imagining Angkor, or imagining connections with Cambodia through his experiences of Angkor Wat, joining up the idea of a Hindu Balinese past with a wider kind of Southeast Asian imagining. Okay, so that's as far as I've got in my explanation of history, but I think there's still more to be done in teasing out these kinds of references. So thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. There's a couple of questions on the
go ahead.
There's a couple of questions online, and we can also take questions from the audience here. Okay.
All right, yeah, so Ellie, you're doing that, yeah.
Do you have a question, Robert?
Later.
Okay. Shall I read out the questions that are on
Yeah.
our Q&A? For everybody here. So the first question is on the subject of Indigenous modern art detached from European artistic teleologies. Could you comment on whether the emergence of the figure of the artist and the social cachet attached to that figure has any Indigenous roots? Southeast Asia may have had creative material culture prior to the colonial period, but could it have Kantian geniuses?
Yeah, okay. Who was that from?
Both anonymous.
Ah, okay. Yeah, it's a really good question. So this is also complicated by the fact that the documentation of traditional art was done in this assumption that, they're all anonymous artists. And as Anthony Ford showed, once he started to do some digging, some anthropological research in the village of Kamasan in Klungkung, that actually people did know each other's names, and they could look at a 19th century painting and say, oh yeah, that was from Grandfather Rumble, or whatever. So it turns out that tradition was not as anonymous as a lot of European representations would have. Now, does that equate to the kind of artistic genius sort of image? Probably not. What we know about all of the different versions, say the artists who were court artists in Central Java, is that they were seen as craftsmen, and they were usually male, although women did colouring and were part of other kinds of activities, but they were more confined to weaving and other things than painting. that within this role of the artist as craftsman, there's certainly a figure of, in Bali, there's the idea of the sanging, and there are legends around these artists who were sanging. So people who had a kind of, we might call it a magical skill to make representations that kind of crossed over the borders between reality and imagined forms, that you have stories like that. And some of these craftsmen, particularly some of the famous artists in the court, certainly, were very became wealthy and were very well looked after by their royal patrons. So to some degree, they certainly had status that was above ordinary peasant status. And it seems like it was also members of the aristocracy, and in Bali, members of the Brahmana caste could also be artists. So that also contributes to the idea of talent. But I guess it's different from the notion of an avant-garde or the notion of the artist as a unique cultural individual. But having said that, then Raden Saleh is somebody who you might think of as having both, like what we know about his life in Europe. He certainly lived a European artist lifestyle and had a great standing in Europe, and then obviously became quite wealthy. That his estate, which is now Taman Ismail Marzuki, but also part of it was part of originally the Jakarta Zoo, and is now part of a hospital, I think. Testifies to the fact that you could achieve both status and wealth as an artist. So, yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you. Do we have any questions in the room either?
Chaitanya.
Chaitanya and Robert, any first?
Thank you. Thank you, Eddie, and thank you very much, Adrian, for that incredibly rich presentation. It's full of ideas, and I have many questions that I'd like to pose, but I'm just going to pose one for the moment, which is to put on my art historian hat, to think about the images on the screen that you have shown us as having distinct objecthoods of their own, of having materialities, and having relationships in scale, and the way in which in knitting together this desired history of Southeast Asian interconnectivities, where does the materiality of the practice figure in your account? Does it figure in your account? And whether we are looking at a woodcut produced mid-century, or a miniature portrait produced at the end of the 19th, or a work such as Putu Sutavijaya's, which are 2.5, 3 meters wide, with very heavy texture, and so there are different classes of objects, it seems to me, with very different disciplinary domains to which they belong, and very different access into the world, very different position within economies and technologies of art making. So it would, to me, it would seem that any effort to make a composite history of connections over here would have to be nuanced to understand the technologies and economies of those productions.
Yeah. Okay, a really complex question. I'm not sure if everybody at home could hear it, but it was about the objecthood of the images, the materiality of practice, and the varieties of different forms, and coming out of different disciplinary domains and different kinds of technologies. I think, that is just in the illustrations I've shown, we've seen some small works on paper, we've seen the even smaller, the Parabike, the manuscript illustrations on a small level versus the larger works, of which Putu Sudwijaya's is one, but also you could similarly see, for example, some of the Raden Saleh paintings were also grand, large, life-size images. I think that story is also to do with the natures of patronage and the particular context that artworks find themselves in. And this is one of the problems, of course, is that, so I mentioned the fact that Indonesia did not have a national gallery until 1999, although the Museum Keramik dan Seni Rupa predates that and was actually meant to be the national gallery, but something happened. Suharto, I think, cut off funding or was not interested. So it's also meant that a lot of the art that was produced up until recent times was not produced for big galleries. So we do get some works that were, and obviously Raden Saleh's were meant either for European art galleries or for things like the Governor General's Palace. And some of those works found their way into the National Museum in Jakarta. But the majority of the patronage was for smaller works in an Indonesian domestic context, which is where the manuscript illustrations or other kinds of smaller works get produced. And in the case of the Balinese modernists, it's a matter of the technology of being given pieces of paper or having ready access to paper that they could then do a whole range of experiments on and sell to tourists in the 1930s onwards. So the different art forms have different explanations depending on what the economic outcome was, or what, how the artists were living off their art, or what kinds of patronage they had. So I guess, a story of technologies would have as one part of its narrative the introduction of Western technology, oil paints, but also paper, of other kinds of paints and so on. But predating those, you also had people working on bark paper or using traditional charcoal forms. So there's not necessarily a kind of technological determinism going on here, but you do have an amazing variety. But you do seem to have people who could move between one form and another. But the added complication is it seems that ephemerality is built into a lot of Asian art. And this is the thing that or Southeast Asian art, the thing that we find hardest to deal with is the idea that an artwork might have a limited lifespan because we want to preserve them in museums. So a lot of the work that I can't find from the 19th century, the story of what happened between Raden Saleh and Sugiono, has disappeared because it was stuff produced on paper that was not actually ever going to last, and nobody was particularly interested in conserving it and keeping it. And so there's a whole other narrative about what does it mean if an artwork is only produced for a certain moment, or even, in the case of some Balinese paintings, produced for a cremation to be burnt as part of a cremation tower. So it's very of the moment and a form of representation that makes connections in a particular time and space, but doesn't have a life beyond that, except if some Europeans come in and said, I'll buy that and put it in a museum in Leiden or London or wherever. So that's not an answer to your question, but it just actually sets me off thinking about that there's a whole other set of things that need to be talked about.
Yeah, thanks very much. I've got a specific question that leads into a broader one. Specific one is those attractive paintings by Nekdim, which were commissioned for a book by Norol Sinu.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about the circumstances in which those paintings were produced? What was the book? Was it never published? There's a broader question arising from that. And the narrative that you have told us, or that you've built up from something that we hadn't known before, is a narrative of artistic integrity, artistic inspiration going from Raden Saleh all the way up to the present. But Nekdim's case and Raden Saleh's case and quite a few other things that you mentioned indicate how important it was that people were willing to buy or commission these works of art. So my question is, can you actually write an adequate history of Southeast Asian art without putting the audience, putting the market at, if not at the centre, then very close to the centre? If Raden Saleh was doing a painting that no one liked, he probably wasn't going to repeat that. He might have discarded it. The same applies to a great many artists, the same applies to a great many academics with their writings, for that matter. So the effect of the community in determining what people produce artistically seems to me a dimension of the story that still has to be told.
Yeah, so the importance of the audience and the ways that different... So I mentioned patronage before, but obviously just having consumers, people who will buy your artworks, is important to most of these artists and in most of those stories. So I'll just totally defer to Roger Nelson and refer you to his research on Nekdim, because anything I know about him is from Roger. I mean, yeah, in the case of Cambodia in the 60s and 70s, Sihanouk was the patron of architecture and art and film and everything else. So you obviously have this idea of him being the sponsor of artists. But we do know from Roger's research that there were other attempts at sponsorship. So USAID, for example, thinking of the Cold War, you've got both sides of the Cold War attempting to sponsor different artists and encourage artists along the way. That is quite significant. I can't remember the complete story of this book, but we mainly know it through a later publication, not through a contemporary publication. But it does seem indeed that that if there were no patrons, the art would not have happened. That is important, except in some of the cases of Balinese artists who I met from the older generation. So Gusti Made de Blog is an artist I spent some time with in the late 70s, but similar to the other artist Irabagus Made from Ubud. That both of those were people you visit their houses and they'd have all these paintings somewhere, and they always had stories about, oh yeah, this collector came, wanted to buy some of my works, but no, I wouldn't sell them. And then they'd say, here's a gift of a painting. So there were definitely people like Gusti de Blog and Irabagus Made who had a sense that artwork should not be about commercial transactions. And I think that also goes back to different kinds of patronage. So thinking of the Central Javanese court patrons, but also what I've been able to reassemble about stories of court patronage in Bali is that you produced as part of your sort of duty to the palace or to a temple, and somehow along the way you also did get rewarded for it, but it should not be a direct commercial transaction. Whereas something produced for tourists, somebody who's passing by on a ship and will be in Bali for a week and will just pay whatever you ask, that's a different kind of relationship. So I guess all of this art has a whole series of other relationships tied up to it, some of which are quite banal, but some of them are much more complex social relations. And yeah, the art is produced within those frameworks of social relations, which is why also, that you do have parallels in other parts of Southeast Asia. So Sihanouk as a royal patron is maybe not that different from Hamengkubuwono VII, or a monastery that is the patron of temple murals in Thailand or Burma. But again, it's a long, complicated question. More questions from?
There are many more questions. There's some of them that we can perhaps group together a little.
Okay.
So there's quite a few questions on methodologies of Southeast Asian art history. So that might be something interesting to address. What are your methodologies for looking for these connections, and what might other Southeast Asian art historians be able to emulate in their work?
Okay. Methodology is serendipity. Having a conversation with Roger Nelson where he shows me these artworks and I go, hang on a minute, that looks like something else I've seen somewhere. So I guess, it's trying to think about, like trying to see as much imagery as possible and look for where it looks like there might be connections in that imagery. So there is a kind of formal analysis. And I think this is also one of the problems that we have with Southeast Asian art history, that up until very recent times, we did not have a lot of illustrations to draw on. So up until around 2000, I think everybody just used Claire Holt's illustrations from her wonderful book. And now her slides have been digitised, they're available online. But then I do think the National Gallery of Singapore has been a really, really important institution. It has done certain things, like it has its own narrative of Southeast Asian art history that was created out of the process of working with a whole lot of art historians, and it's both now and in the past has got an incredible range of very, very talented art historians working there that has put that story together, although some of us might also want to deconstruct it a bit to think about other aspects of the historiography. But the National Gallery of Singapore has also provided us with exposure to a lot of artworks that otherwise might not have been seen. And so, going back to the 70s and 80s when I was, because I've always been interested in art, but it was really hard to actually, go to Indonesia and see modern Indonesian artworks. I was lucky enough to just by coincidence be in Jakarta in 1978 when one of the, what's now the Biennale exhibitions were on. But you might otherwise have just seen them in private collections that became museums, like the Necker Gallery or the Agung Rai Gallery, that up until, as I said, 1999, there was no National Gallery with a permanent exhibition where you could go along and say, okay, these are the Indonesian artists. So essentially, we need more publications, we need more online sites or whatever that just provide us with those illustrations so that we can visually start to look at connections and see how we might put that together. But then, you've also got the problem of working in different languages, that you've got a bunch of material published in English, but there are books on art history and catalogues of exhibitions that might have also been quite ephemeral, but in a whole range of languages that you would really need to speak 12 languages to do this properly, or have people who did speak the 12 languages working together to try to say, okay, this is what's happening in Vietnam, and we know that these Indonesian artists went to Saigon to exhibit as part of a Cito exhibition in 1961. How might we put that story together, or what might North Vietnamese artists have been doing at the same time in collaboration with German collectors or German patrons. But trying to get more of the archive, more of the records together, I think is quite important. Indonesia has the Indonesian Visual Art Archive, which has a lot of material online. The National Gallery of Singapore is put together and is still working on a good archival and library connection. So it's doing a lot of the basics in the archives that pays off.
Thank you. I don't think we'll get through all of the questions, but another theme that seems to be quite often coming up across a few different questions is the idea of Southeast Asia itself and how you define it, and what might be the connections that we can use to create a framework around Southeast Asian art history, whether they emerge from events or material or patterns of cultural interaction. Historical and present day.
So the idea of Southeast Asia, those of us who read a bit into the history, we've got a number of essayists. I think it was Emerson first pointed out that it's only a post-World War II term, coming from World War II. So you might have Indigenous categories like Nusantara or Lands Below the Winds, which is actually an Arabic one, but there's always this fundamental question of, is there a Southeast Asia? Does it exist? And historians of Southeast Asia have been wrestling with this for a long time. I think, again, this is this question of doing more historical work to look at connections and to try to trace. So like the art, we see parallels, we see similar things happening in each country, but we see a bunch of other connections. So say the 1960s, 70s student movement, where you had student demonstrators in Thailand, in the Philippines and in Indonesia all at the same time. This is obviously connecting both with global phenomena, but also telling us something that's going on in Southeast Asia itself. So it's those kinds of things where we can look at it and look at that inter-referencing, as Charbeng White has asked us to do, about where other parts of Southeast Asia refer to each other, key moments like Bandung, for bringing people together, and Sukarno's formulation of the, so what is it? It's the Jakarta, Phnom Penh, Hanoi, Beijing, Pyongyang axis. So the idea of people trying to make connections. Cito is another one. And some of those organisations, and then later ASEAN, also try to create art links there. So but Southeast Asia is something that only works when Southeast Asians start referring to each other.
That's a really excellent point to end on, and I think that answers the last question from Charlotte to some extent, perhaps.
Okay.
But
Good.
I'm sure you can continue many of those conversations
All right. Good.
at a later date. Thanks so much. I think we'll make up the last question as it's now just after 5. And I'll just hand back to Robert to close
Okay.
the session.
Well, Adrian, thank you very much indeed. Adrian and I go back a long way, and Adrian knows that I know very little about art history. But this was a lecture which made sense of it, even for me. So on behalf of all of those for whom it made sense, and those who are at a much higher level who very clearly also got a great deal out of it, thanks very much, Adrian.
Okay. Thank you, Robert.